the U.S. tells NATO to increase spending and take on more of its own defense.
The president has said 2% is not enough, and we're going to argue that up to 5% is the necessary investment from NATO countries to ensure we're able to meet the threats of the future, whether that's Russia on the continent or an ascendant China.
NATO Secretary General Rutte agrees.
We have to ramp up defense spending because we know we cannot protect ourselves 4 or 5 years from now if we don't.
Breaking down the Trump administration's plans for restructuring the alliance.
Right now, the administration is signaling we're not anti-European, we're not anti-NATO, but we need Europe to step up. We're disappointed in the progress we've seen so far.
Today is Thursday, February 13th, and this is The Issue from VOA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.
And we say this in solidarity, is you have to spend more on your defense, for your country, on that continent, understanding that the American military and the American people stand beside you as we have in NATO.
Tough love to NATO from U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on Thursday.
We are very much committed to the NATO alliance and to our allies, but without burden sharing, without creating the right set of incentives for European countries to invest, then we would be forced to attempt to be everywhere for everybody all the time, which in a world of fiscal restraints is, again, to get back to that word reality, just not reality.
Hegseth said European countries need to start spending 5% of their GDP on defense, up from the current 2% mandate. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said he agreed that NATO must do more.
We have to ramp up defense spending because we know we cannot protect ourselves 4 or 5 years from now if we don't. And also we need to ramp up defense spending because it is clear that the US rightly requires us to do more here on the European side and the Canadian side of NATO. It's only fair, it's only sensible.
And British Defense Secretary John Healey also agreed.
We heard his call for European nations to step up. We are and we will.
You know, Lori, there is a building consensus, even on the European side, that this is the right way to go, that it's not fair that the United States has basically been propping up the defense of Europe since the end of World War II.
And now they're getting a nudge.
Yeah, I mean, even as far back as the Obama administration, President Obama said, you've got to spend more. And I think that's where the whole 2% thing came from.
Right. Now they're getting a stronger nudge.
Yeah, well, 5%'s a lot bigger chunk of their annual budget.
Let's get some help understanding these new U.S. policies and relations with the alliance. Joining us now is Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities.
So thank you so much for being able to join us and talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk big picture. What are the big takeaways from Secretary Hegseth's first visit to NATO?
Well, I think yesterday he made 3 main points. The first 2 are about Ukraine, and the third one was a broader point about the U.S. role in NATO. So on Ukraine, I think he said 2 important things. The first was that the United States does not see a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders as an achievable objective of the current war, which I think is really just an admission of the reality and something that President Zelensky has himself said. Second, he said that Ukraine's NATO membership would also likely not be part of a war settlement. He's since walked that back a little bit to say that everything is still on the table, so there's a little bit of ambiguity there, but I think that also is really an admission of reality. There are a number of NATO members who have pushed back hard on bringing Ukraine into NATO right now. Maybe down the line is something to consider. And then the third broader point about the U.S. role in NATO was really to make it clear to the Europeans that the United States, which has really underwritten and carried the majority of the burden of Europe's security since the formation of NATO after World War II, that it could no longer carry that burden on its own. and that Europe would really have to step up and take the lead on its defense, that the United States still supports NATO and wants to be a part of the alliance, but that it could no longer be the leader and the major funder of the alliance's activities.
It's interesting because there were concerns previously that the U.S. under a new Trump administration might pull out of NATO, but apparently that is not what it sounds like now at all.
At least not at this moment. I think the hope of many in the Trump administration is that by being very clear about the European responsibility, that will force or encourage Europe to actually step up, and that the United States will be able to remain in NATO without carrying so much of the burden, and that would forestall any sort of larger divorce. I think whether or not that works is an open question. President Trump is certainly not the first president to come into office hoping to shift burdens onto the Europeans. The problem is that while that talk sounds great, when Europe doesn't step up and there's a crisis, the U.S. rushes in to save the day. And so there hasn't really been a credible signal that the U.S. is serious about asking Europe to step up more. Now, Hegseth's language yesterday was very different and much more brusque and straightforward than past secretaries of defense have been. So maybe that prompts a change. But it could require more significant moves, such as changes in U.S. force posture in Europe to get to force that change. So I think the long-term question about the U.S. role in NATO is still a little bit of an open question, but certainly right now the administration is signaling we're not anti-European, we're not anti-NATO, but we need Europe to step up. We're disappointed in the progress we've seen so far.
Hegseth gave them a target of 5% of GNP to turn towards military spending. And Secretary General Root, in his news conference on Thursday, said we have to spend more, we have to step up, and it seemed to be an echo of what Hegseth was saying.
I think that's true. I think Europe does recognize that they need to spend more. But I think the challenge remains finding the money to do so. I think 5% is an unrealistic goal for most of the countries in Europe, at least in the near and medium term. Some of the Baltic states, as well as Poland, are already pushing towards that goal. But the countries that really matter with the big GDPs like Germany and France are still a long way. And they have struggled to even get to the 2% mark. So I'm a little bit pessimistic that they're going to be at 5% anytime in the near term. Just because the budget changes would be significant and take time to get through what are divided parliaments in both cases. But the bigger picture here is that I think the actual focus on the spending target is a little bit of an unhelpful distraction. I think that the message that the United States is sort of trying to send here, and that Hegseth alluded to a little bit, is that Europe needs to step up and take responsibility for its defense on its own, not spend more underneath U.S. leadership. And there's a subtle difference there that I think should be teased out, and that focusing on the 5% is a little bit doesn't actually get at the root of the problem, which is that Europe hasn't taken responsibility for its own defense for decades now.
One of the things he talked about was the ability of not only Europe, but the United States as well, of being able to even manufacture arms. And he said, the Ukraine situation just showed how vulnerable both Europe and the United States was when it came to cranking out shells. And even beyond that, he said when allies order jet fighters, the delivery date is 7 years out, and that needs to be 3 years out.
Well, the Ukraine war, I think, definitely called attention to some of the shortcomings in our defense industrial base, both the United States and the broader NATO alliance. I don't think they were unknown to people who were following it closely, but they definitely pulled out a lot of the challenges and the bottlenecks, made those much more visible. It also underscored the fact that modern war is very costly and requires a lot of stuff. It not only requires advanced fighter jets, but also just millions of rounds of ammunition. And there has to be a balance between the mass and the high-tech stuff. And our defense industrial base just isn't set up for fighting a war in that way because we haven't had to do it in so long. And so I think Hegseth is right, that we do need to have investment in defense industrial base. It should be smart investment so that we're investing in the types of capabilities that we actually think we're going to need to fight a war, and a balance, again, between the mass and the high tech. But Europe is even in a worse situation because they tend to get most of their defense equipment from the United States. And so that's another thing that I think has to change, is that Europe really needs to build up its own industrial base so that it can manufacture and be a little bit more self-sufficient in the defense space. Now, it's a little bit controversial in some parts of the United States, especially in Congress and among defense contractors, because that would mean less business for U.S. firms. But if the goal here is to get Europe to be able to do more on its own without relying on the U.S. for everything, then that's also a necessary step, is that Europe develops a more robust, capable, and independent defense industrial base.
So what about expansion of NATO in general? Is that at all beneficial to the U.S. or is it detrimental?
I mean, that's a controversial question. My view is that continued expansion of NATO is a bad idea for the United States for a couple of reasons. The first is that continued expansion of NATO only expands the U.S. security burdens. Even if Europe steps up, if NATO gets bigger and that Article 5 guarantee extends to more countries, that's more risk the U.S. would get pulled into a war. There would be a lot of political pressure to send U.S. forces where a NATO ally attacked. And that would then have ripple effects in terms of not only cost of lives, but military costs, economic costs. So in my view, that would be a bad choice. I also think that the expansion of the alliance is something that's increased tensions between Russia and NATO and Russia and the United States. And so I don't necessarily see that as a productive way if our goal here is to have a more stable Europe and a more secure Europe. Expanding NATO's borders at this point goes against commitments that the U.S. made decades ago about NATO expansion and its limits, and just provokes a potential response from Russia that has long-term negative consequences for the United States.
Jennifer, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for having me.
That was Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities.
I think Secretary Hegseth articulated it well, and Jennifer sort of backed up the concept of the United States has a full plate. It's not just Europe, but there's also the Indo-Pacific region where China has become a major threat, and it needs this relief in Europe, and it needs Europe to take a more active role in defending Europe.
And what's really interesting, Scott, is that there was no pushback, really, as far as we could see. They really seemed to be in agreement with these new policies.
I think what everybody believes from what I heard is this will make the alliance stronger.
You've been listening to The Issue from the Voice of America.
And don't forget, you can get news anytime you want, 24/7. On our website, voanews.com.
In Washington, I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.